will return.
I think this is working. Is it working? Are we here? Oh my gosh! Okay, so we're moving into this. Um, it's a terrible opening. I have no idea how to open things anymore. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Ludic Society after, God, nearly a year. Before we get started, we have a couple things we need to run through here. First, we want to remind you that the Ludic Society and really all of Serious Play is brought to you in partnership with the Center for 21st Century Studies. They're doing some very cool stuff. I believe stuff with nurturing right now. They are recently, I think Richard and a few others are publishing a book called The Log 2020 as well about the COVID pandemic. So that's available. You can find them on Twitter under the UWM Center for 21st Century Studies. We're also brought to you in partnership with Vehemence. I see Trauma and Mediocre in the chat. It's wonderful to have you guys back. If you are looking for some cool places to play some ARGs, might I recommend you jump upon the Ship of the Vehemence QR code right there for you all. Check it out. And now, show. Hopefully the chat works and people can see it while we're doing this. We will see. I was commiserating with my co-hosts that I don't ever know if anything's gonna work anymore. Tired X Ghost in the chat is saying, "Holy fuck, it's Alex Hera."
Ghost is my #1 fan.
Ghost,
maybe #2. Depends.
Ghost has left you some amazing questions at the exact last minute. I have put them in the live VC, so hopefully we'll get to them.
I did an at everyone in the Walker Creek Discord, so
that's perfect. And now Mediocre is telling us that you have wonderful hair. So
we all have wonderful hair. Yeah, supposedly.
All right. Well, geez, I guess Alex Hera needs no introduction at all. But unfortunately, my co-hosts do, and we also have an introduction for Alex. So, new co-hosts of the Ludic Society, would you like to introduce yourselves?
I'll go first if that's okay. My name's Kit. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a Master's of Library Science student here at UWM with a focus in archives. So I've got some skills that are useful when it comes to ARG stuff. But yeah, that is who I am.
And I'm the other co-host. My name's Robert. I'm a graduate student in anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I previously got a master's degree in history here as well. I've spent my whole life in southeastern Wisconsin here, and I'm really happy to be in this stream. And I currently work on studying digital anthropology and digital culture.
I've got
but great to be here.
Some Midwestern folks.
Yes.
I'm sorry. And as you guys know, or maybe you don't, maybe it's your first time. Who's to say? I'm Wren. I'm a PhD student now at UWM, doing ARG archival and other associated stuff. I'm also a serial associate producer. I can't not mention that. I guess it's less serial, more associate producer, although it's fun to say as if I'm doing like 17 associate producer jobs at the same time. So I have to say before we get into this, what cereal, Michael? I you know what? Cinnamon Toast Crunch. That's that's the cereal I have come up with. So I'd be remiss not to mention it, given that I've worked, with Alex, and it's. I feel like you guys should know that going into an interview, that I'm biased hopelessly, in favor of the History of Analog Horror documentary. I would love to hear you introduce yourself, Alex. But first, Robert, would you like to read our very professional, extremely well-developed introduction of Alex Hera?
Yes, absolutely, Wren. I would like to read it, considering I wrote it here yesterday. Alex Hera is an independent documentarian, filmmaker, and unfiction creator. He's responsible for the creation of a documentary on the genre of analog horror, the alternative reality game Walker Creek, and a documentary on the making of that alternative reality game, along with several short films. He's also working on a forthcoming project that will be to be announced. So please welcome to the show, Alex Hera.
Thank you so much for having me. As Robert said, my name is Alex, and I did make the History of Analog Horror, and I made a web series called Walker Creek, which was an ARG that ran from 2020 to 2021. And I made a documentary about the making of Walker Creek, which is what sparked my passion for documentary filmmaking.
Thank you so much for coming on. Honestly, we're the people who are honored to be doing this. We've talked about this in private. Our audience is tiny. Your audience is vastly bigger. You are doing us a favor, as every guest ever has on this show. So here's how this is going to work for the folks at home. We have questions of our own. We have questions from fans. You guys can ask questions live in the stream chat. Me and Kit and Robert are working together to try and make sure that we get the audience questions in there. They're the ones that matter most to us. But we, of course, also have things we'd like to know. We're hoping to talk about the history of analog horror first and foremost. However, Walker Creek, as well as the documentary on Walker Creek, are on the table, and we're all relatively up to date on those things. I'm sure the Walker Creek experts in the chat will school me on quite a few things, and as they should. Yeah, I mean, we're hoping to take a short intermission in the middle. It is hard to do a 2-hour interview or so, I'm told. So we will take maybe 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes there. But otherwise, you're stuck with us until my power goes out. Well, not until my power goes out, until the stream ends. But yeah, or, you know, a weird worm bites me, and then you're not stuck with me anymore. You're stuck with somebody who looks a hell of a lot like me, I guess.
It does happen.
So, all right, and the chat is amazing, and Briver 64 has said Alex made the entire history of analog horror all by himself.
Yeah.
That is true. Yeah.
I didn't know you were a local 58 guy.
Little known fact. I've actually been, making analog horror since before I was born,
Yeah.
Wow.
That's the power you have.
Yeah.
You were the War of the Worlds guy?
I
had no
made War
idea.
of the Worlds in 1938. That's true. Yeah.
Who's Orson Welles? Never heard of him.
So I don't know where we would like to begin, but I suppose we begin at the beginning. So I assume one of the audience questions probably where to start.
Sure.
Well, we did have one that we wanted to kick off with just to kind of get the conversation flowing.
Yeah.
And as the question proctor, I'm going to throw it over to Kit.
Okay, great. I had a wonderful question for you. What scares you?
A lot of things.
Okay, great.
Well, in real life, I don't like the ocean, and I don't like spiders. Outside of that, if we're talking horror, really,
Yes.
I am very obsessed with cosmic horror, and a lot of reality bending stuff. Those are my two kind of main focuses when I watch horror movies or when I write horror.
Mm-hmm.
So, places where reality is somehow wrong, or where there's things that are just happening that are truly incomprehensible to the human mind. Like that is what truly terrifies me, is the incomprehensible and the unknowable. Which kind of does tie into my fear of the ocean, actually, because the thing that scares me most about it is all the unknowable stuff down there that we don't know. So it does all tie together to an extent, yeah.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I don't know. They ask it in your the creator of Local 58 says to create horror, you have to ask yourself, what are you afraid of? And I feel
Mhm.
like it's a great answer, especially since
Yeah.
you do a lot of work with unfiction and a lot of like analog horror has a basis in that kind of oh shoot, I forgot the word now. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I for some reason now I'm also thinking on Walker Creek and its underlying obsession with bodies of water. Not maybe the main
little bit,
point,
yeah.
but it's there.
It's there.
It's
There are
there.
big worms in the lake.
There are huge worms in the lake.
Well, just one big worm actually, but
see, I'm learning. See, this is the problem, and I always don't know things about the ARGs that we talk about. It's hard to. I find it's very difficult to ascertain everything about an ARG all at once. But I am thinking
it's like near impossible unless you spend hundreds of hours on it.
Yeah, but I am thinking now of have you played Alan Wake? Because I am thinking about the whole it's not
Alan
a lake,
Wake.
it's an ocean thing.
It's so good.
Yeah.
I love that game. Yeah.
Definitely came to mind watching the finale of Walker Creek, and
Oh yeah.
And just with the concept of incomprehensibility as an aspect of horror, kind of it really gets down to the core of the fact that as sentient beings, we can kind of get wrapped up in our own ability to accumulate knowledge and our ability to know what we see as the unknowable, but really we are quite small
Yeah.
as humans, and there's I mean, obviously we live on this rock kind of out in the middle of the universe. So there's quite a bit that we have absolutely no knowledge of, and there are plenty of things out there that we could potentially encounter that are incomprehensible to us. So I just feel like that really kind of digs straight to the core of where that feeling of horror, of the and fear of the incomprehensible really comes from.
Yeah, yeah, I absolutely agree. And I mean, all horror really comes from the fear of the incomprehensible to an extent, because even like the overall horror rule, like don't show the monster. That's so that you don't know as much about it. So it all ties in.
So, I want to move on to one of the fan questions that was posted in the Vehemence chat. It says, Alex, you are one of the most promising pioneers in ARG space, I truly believe. Do you feel an amount of pressure with the work you're presenting? Not only are you presenting new ARG content, eventually, hopefully, but also documenting and making in depth, well made videos displaying the format those who may not even be aware of the medium. I guess the
Well,
question is, do you feel an amount of pressure with the work you're doing?
Well, first off, that's very kind of you, whoever that was. And second off, definitely yes. Uh, Pressure of kind of pushing boundaries is something I've always felt throughout my work in unfiction and the overall field. Even going all the way back to Walker Creek, there were some things there. I did talk a bit in the making of documentary about certain things where I was sort of pushing the boundaries of immersion or like adding in more gamey aspects here and there and like doing slightly different things, especially with like analog horror, blending analog horror with modern day vlog storytelling and, all that kind of stuff. So we're trying to push the boundaries, not necessarily of unfiction, but of analog horror. And so that was, yeah, I was under some pressure there and definitely concerned about it. With the making of documentary, that was another thing where it's like, the curtain doesn't often get pulled back on ARGs and on unfiction. It's not something that I've seen very often. Like the most you usually see is a couple of Q&As maybe with the creators of an ARG. You don't see like a full-fledged expose on the entire creative process from beginning to end with like full behind the scenes footage and everything. It's pretty rare. So with that documentary, I was a little like I wasn't necessarily concerned because it was what I wanted to do. But I was mildly worried that like one, it might spoil the game for the fan base. They might feel like, oh, it's ruined now because you pulled back the curtain. Luckily, that didn't happen. They loved it and they still love Walker Creek. But the other concern was that it just wouldn't be popular or well liked as a film. And that also wasn't really true. That film is actually what got me some more connections in the unfiction field and basically made me have any sort of name in the field and eventually led to some of the connections that I used to make the analog horror documentary. And with that one I was especially concerned because that was like even more pulling back the curtain. Uh Especially with like most of those creators had never been interviewed before. Chris Straub had like barely talked about Local 58, like the creative process behind it, had barely talked about it publicly. So, I did have some concern for that as well, that it would not be well received, that I would have wasted 6 months on something that the unfiction community will go, this is just behind the scenes and it's just ruining the immersion. I'm not interested. But that also wasn't true. So, from my two documentaries, I've kind of been shown that like my instincts are right about it and that people do have a desire to see the curtain pulled back. And that's already proven to some extent with like, credits in analog horror videos and stuff like that. But my documentary work has proven to me even more that like the immersion is not necessarily the same as it used to be in ARGs, where we're able to pull back the curtain and still let ourselves be immersed in the games. And so, going forward, it's something that I do feel a lot less concerned with. Like I think with my next documentary, which is going to be a similar pulling back the curtain, interviewing creators. I don't really feel any concern about it anymore because I know that people enjoyed it in the past. Like the analog horror documentary was kind of the end of my concern with that. But I do have concern for my next ARG because, again, I want to push boundaries. And so with my next ARG, I'm definitely going to be playing around with filmmaking styles and with the level of immersion and reality bending and, maybe making trailers and things like that and seeing like kind of where can I push it, where can I not, what can I do to sort of make this more cinematic while still being found footage? And so, I will have some concern when I get to that, but not for my documentaries right now. No.
I do have to follow that up and ask. So, Chris Straub hasn't been interviewed before. You're negotiating that interview. You're sitting down
Well,
and
Chris
talking
Cobb
to
has been interviewed, but not about Local 58.
Right. Well, either way, right? To say that he hasn't talked about this project, which I mean that puts you in an incredible position where suddenly now, I mean, sure, pressure, yes, but I mean, where Chris has the opportunity to just surprise you at every turn.
Mhm.
And so I wonder how much of, because we talked some about it in private, but how much of that interview uh, was like, at what point were you sitting there and you were like, fuck, this is gold all the way through? Were there moments that uh, you hadn't anticipated in a way that changed the direction of the rest of the interview?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, with Chris, that was an incredible interview because I knew that there was so little information about Local 58's creative process and behind the scenes. There was, I believe, like one Reddit AMA, and that was kind of it. So I felt very lucky to be able to actually interview Chris and be the person to sort of dig at what had actually happened to make this series a reality and what drove Chris to make it and things like that. Um, and the biggest thing that surprised me during that interview was really that Chris dug a lot into the nature of horror and what makes things terrifying. And that was something I didn't really get from most of the other interviewees in that documentary. They all had great things to say about the analog medium and about analog horror and unfiction and ARGs, but Chris really had a lot to say about the nature of horror, like as a genre, and fear as a feeling. And that was really incredible. And that gave me more insight into his creative process than anything I could have asked about, like the making of Local 58. Though I did also get a lot of great information about that. There was so much that we talked about related to what he thought in making it, and especially what he thought about the community that's sprung up now. There's a bit in the documentary where he talks about like the people just cutting their teeth on making stories or making videos in analog horror and how he thinks that's a good thing. So there was a lot of very interesting things in that interview. Like so much of it I was just sitting there and I was like, this is gold. And you can tell in the documentary, like Chris gets either the first or second most screen time out of all the interviewees. So, and I cut, there were multiple scenes in the documentary that had more from Chris that I cut because I was like, this is so interesting, but it doesn't really fit into the story of analog horror. This is just about like the general nature of horror and like Chris's personal backstory. And it's like fascinating stuff, but I ended up cutting it. There was so much because I interviewed Chris for 2 hours and I only got through about half of my questions because one, his answers were so in depth, and two, we kept getting completely sidetracked talking about the nature of horror and like all this other stuff. It was a fantastic interview.
How many hours of footage do you think you would, if you used everything that you had that was worth using? How long would the documentary have been?
I believe I have about 8 hours of interview footage. So if I just cut out the good parts, it's probably like because me asking the questions wouldn't be included. So like maybe like 4 hours or 5 hours of interview content. Uh, but yeah, no, that the history of analog horror could have been a full mini series if I wanted it to be. But I kind of decided, I should dedicate only maybe 6 months of my life to this instead of 18.
Fair. Incredibly fair.
Yeah.
So another question that we want to move on to, that was written by us, actually that was written by me, is kind of trying to get to the bottom of defining unfiction. I know this is um, thin ice, I guess, or somewhat unexplored territory where we can get a little bit into contentious definitions of this. But more so, I want to ask is, can we identify really where unfiction departs from reality, or what we would like think of as the really real? Or do you think unfiction is more of a mix of what's really real and then the not real?
So I
Um,
should I should press you, Robert. Can you give a quick definition for the folks who maybe have not or and a quick idea of where the really real comes from for people in the chat who might want to look into it and have no idea where to start?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, where I'm drawing this concept from is Lacan, the psychologist and theorist Lacan, talking about that concept of the real. And I encourage folks to go and look this up and do a little bit of reading on it because it's a contentious concept. But really, when you think about it, like what does the real mean? What does it mean for something to be real? That's something that Lacan was trying to approach in how we, the human mind processes the concept of reality. And then it was later expanded upon by many theorists, including Mark Fisher in his works. But yeah, where does unfiction, like, is unfiction a spot where the real meets the unreal? Or what's kind of the relationship there?
I think that's a really tricky question because it's like the thing is, every time someone makes a definition of unfiction, a new project comes along that blows up the definition. Like, where we're like, well, this is unfiction, but it doesn't fit the definition we have. So now we have to revise the definition. So that's kind of a constant struggle. Um, I think that, unfiction as a whole, I approach it more from the perspective of a creator. I know a lot of people approach it more from the perspective of how it feels for like players. Generally, I approach unfiction. I think about like really what the creator's intention is for the most part. If they're trying to make something that's like believably real, and if they're trying to just make a fictional project. And I mean the player base does have some amount of impact on that as well, of course. But yeah.
It is that is a judicious answer. I don't know what the correct way to go about it is, but I do think there's instead of just being like yeah, I think there is some value in asking the question, especially given that you have performed an entire documentary in service of examining analog horror,
Yeah.
of what the value is of holding fast to, or even just presenting a series of definitions if we know they're going to be exploded. Now, I have my own internal thought process on this, but I'm more interested in where you come from as an artist and also as a historian.
Well, in terms of actually creating definitions, I think it doesn't really matter if they get blown up later on or not, because I mean, the point is like the analog horror documentary. I mean, you know this, Ren. I spent a lot of time debating about what the definition of analog horror should be for the purposes of that film. And what I ended up deciding on was that I would start out with one definition, and then over the course of the documentary, I would change it. And I would present a new project and be like, "Well, this is kind of an exception, so then we'll revise the definition." So there's some of that going on during the whole film, and I'm sure that in the future, in the coming years, that definition will be changed even more, and I'll be proven to be wrong or outdated somehow. And so, but it's what matters at the time, I think, and what matters for the purposes you're trying to achieve. Like right now, I'm doing some unfiction research and planning out a film. And so the definition of unfiction I'm using is basically online stories that blur the lines between reality and fiction. And that's not a definition everyone will agree with, and that's not necessarily like the best definition of unfiction, but it's the best definition of unfiction for my purposes right now. So that's the one I'm going with.
Yeah, that's very much my thought process is very similar to that. But again, it's interesting to hear you say it, interesting to get your conception of it in those specific words. So thanks for entertaining my pedantic question. Um, I don't when I'm gonna let my co-hosts riff, But we have a couple dumb and great audience questions that we have to get to at some point very soon. Your Walker Creek fans are lovely, and goddamn,
They're a little goofy sometimes.
They're just being really silly in the chat.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, when it comes to like creating definitions of things or just categories for things, like it is. I mean, it's time marches on, like and things change and definitions change and what fits within any type of synthetic category or genre is fundamentally altered over time. And so I think that I mean I think it's an excellent answer to say that well we have to make it we have to use these concepts for for our purposes as creators for what we're working on in the now and if if it fits within what we conceptualize as unfiction what we're creating fits within that then that's the right way to think about it in definition terms. I don't think we have to hold really hard and fast to those to rigid definitions across space and time. So that's a really excellent answer from my perspective. I do want to toss it over to Kit to ask a question, a foundational question.
Ooh. Oh, I thought we were going to the audience question next.
Oh yeah,
the
do we
audience
want to do it?
Cool.
yeah,
Yeah.
we got a whole
Yeah, let's do an
cavalcade
audience.
of amazing audience questions. This is gonna be fun because we've got like 3 audience questions now that I'm told are inside jokes.
Oh, no.
So this
Oh,
one
no.
is wonderful. This is from Tired X Ghost. How many other Alexes in ARGs could you kill?
Yeah, there are a lot of Alexes, both in front of the camera and behind. It's actually genuinely insane how many there are. It's yeah, it gets difficult and it's so weird, like, especially because some of the Alexes are people that I interact with. Like, I'm talking with Alex Kistner. It's like, hey Alex, hey Alex. Like,
I imagine that can get very confusing.
it does. Yeah.
Very, very Night Vale Kill Your Double vibes.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's when I send a message that starts with "Hey Alex" and then they don't respond and I read it, like I see it in my text list and I'm like, "Wait, someone texted me?" And I go read it. I'm like, "Wait, I sent this message."
Yeah.
Mediocre thinks you could take Alex Bale.
Also, someone in the chat
think
said
that's-
the A in ARG stands for Alex, which I think is also very silly.
Alex reality game.
Yeah.
Could describe some games for sure.
Oh yeah, that's definitely Marble Hornets is an Alex.
Yeah,
reality
exactly.
game. We did have another one. I think this is also from Ghost, so we could just knock this out here. It's in the live chat. I know it's I have to ask Robert to get it because it'll screw Streamlabs over if I try to get it. It's the first one.
Oh, in the Twitch live chat.
In the Twitch live chat, yeah.
Yeah.
It's the first one in that list.
Um. Is it after? How many Alexes could this Alex kill?
Oh, it might have just been the same
Where
one.
were you?
My bad. Oh, where were you? Yes, it's the where were you one. Yeah.
Were you? Okay, where were you the night of July 17th, 1983? 7 dead, 14 wounded, 8 in critical condition, 9 never found. What did you do?
I genuinely don't know what this is referencing. Could I know? Genuinely don't.
Oh no.
Oh,
Like,
like, great.
If Ghost said it, Ghost expects me to know, but I don't.
Oh man, most normal ghost message.
Ghost message. That's very true.
Oh man. Well, yeah. Why don't the other one you've got from Tetra Decadecimal here is Alexandra Zygamut from the Epic department here. I was an active player of Walker Creek actually, and I remember this one rumor about one of the characters, Adam. I think I remember a rumor going around that he was into Fuzzy Wuzzy Bunny Boys. Is it true?
No, no.
not true.
I already literally, I think a year ago now, you asked me this question and I told you no.
Just had to clarify.
Tetra throughout all of Walker Creek was the biggest troll. I think there was a full website created by the character Adam in game, uh, basically admonishing them for being.
So you made a whole website
I
just to
did.
troll your
Well,
fan
it was one web page to troll a very specific fan, and it was.
That's incredible. I remember the Walker Creek doc that you God, I'm having it's leaving my brain right now, but one was it it's the character, it's Adam, but it's Adam pre you being Adam.
Yeah.
That you had no intention of the players gravitating
Mhm.
towards, and they just did. This is where the emergence question comes in. You know, in narrative theory, when we're talking about networked narratives, we consider them to have two prongs: a distributed narrative, which is the transmediation, you know, files you find in random places for the audience if you're not familiar, and then all that white space that isn't narrative, but the audience kind of puts it together. That gives birth
Mhm.
to what we call emergence, and that's the emergent narrative, the things that arise naturally out of the network that are unpredictable at first. And so this is kind of a two-pronged question that me and Robert were talking about earlier. One part is, you know, these moments of emergence clearly happened in Walker Creek. How
Mhm.
was it to pivot around them and try to grapple with them? And two, now that you're doing historical work with other projects that may well deal with these kinds of emergences, how do you try and get your hands around a history that is, you know, subject to those kinds of weird kind of just why did this happen moments?
Well, within Walker Creek, generally, because so much of Walker Creek was sort of made up as it went along, I was able to really embrace those moments and sort of work with them. And, there were some things where, like, the fans started to gravitate towards it, and I kind of forced them away from it because I didn't want to deal with it. But most of the time, I did kind of embrace what they were thinking or what they wanted, and found a way to build it in that I thought actually made sense and made for a more compelling story. Like especially Adam is the biggest example in Walker Creek because that was a whole character that was not planned that ended up becoming like basically the third protagonist of the series. So, like, that was a really big one, and that was really unexpected. I never expected to play Adam, and I never expected Adam to even exist, really. As I said, it was literally an accident because I wanted to create like a dozen accounts for like fake town residents, and I made Adam first, and then Instagram told me I couldn't make any more accounts. So he just that was how he existed. So he's like the only one. So I was like, okay, well this guy exists now. And then again, they weren't supposed to even message him. He was supposed to be just world building, just atmosphere. He was following the Walker Creek tourism account. And so they were supposed to click on and so it's not like there's zero followers and it's not like it's a fake town. It's like now they can look and they see there's people in Walker Creek following it. But since he was the only one, they expected it to be a piece of the game that like led them somewhere. And so they started like DMing him. And I was like, now I have to like literally come up with a character on the fly and figure out what his purpose is as they're sending me messages, like literally texting me. And so I did. And then I was like, well, now that he's actually like a fixture in the game, I guess I'll see where I can take him. And so then a bunch of things started developing. Eventually, like I needed a character that like could actually be the face of the tourism bureau, and I was like, well, I got this guy. He said he was just a resident in the texts, but I'll just give that a quick retcon, and now he's the leader of the tourism bureau. So, and from there, I was like, well, now I need someone to be like the secret rebel leader in the end. Wouldn't it be really interesting if the leader of the tourism bureau was actually the secret rebel leader? Let's do that. Oh,
Yeah.
I need someone to do these live calls with the audience because I want to do like a live call interactive thing. Well, I could do live calls. I could play the character. And so, it just spun out and then Adam became the basically honestly Adam overshadowed the actual main character a lot of the time, which was not really on purpose, but it just kind of happened because he was so much more nuanced than the actual protagonist. So,
There were several
yeah,
times I know me and Kit were talking back and forth where we were like, well, Alex is also like the best actor on
yeah.
camera most of
Yeah.
the time. So, and maybe Kit wants to say something about that. I don't know. Try to throw it your way.
Well, yeah. No, I think it's really interesting and it can be incredibly hard to direct yourself. Like I have a
Mhm.
background in acting and voice acting. So the fact that like you had the ability to like push yourself as an actor and as a director, I just think is incredibly like stunning.
Thank you so
Um
much.
yeah, no, it's really cool. But yeah, what do you when it comes to your performance as Alex, like what do you think what were some of like the personality traits? And it you said Alex is a more nuanced character than the protagonist or the main protagonist. So what kind of led to the development of Alex in the writing on the spot of how do I respond to these text messages? I'm kidding.
Yeah, well, so Adam, initially, like in the text messages, his very first personality trait was being an asshole. Like literally,
Fair.
that was the foundation of the character because they started DMing him, and I didn't have a character, and I didn't want to talk to them because this wasn't supposed to be a character. So I was just trying to get rid of them. So I just was a complete asshole over the text, and they loved it. They loved it. And so I was like, well, this is his character now.
Mhm.
And it helped that the audience, as I said, they're really goofy. Like the fan base is so goofy. They treat it as a joke, which is good because Walker Creek generally is kind of self-aware. It
Mhm.
does embrace the goofiness of what the hosted are and the whole lore and everything. It does embrace the goofiness. And Adam is the ultimate uh part of embracing the goofiness because they always troll Adam and they always kind of treated him as more of a joke than he was like in the story. And so
Yeah.
it provided a good foil. They really attached to Adam because they would joke with Adam and Adam would, be really cold and he would kind of not take the joke, but they thought it
Mhm.
was hilarious that he didn't take the joke. So
Yeah.
basically they got even more attached. They kept pushing him even further. I kept pushing back even further. We developed like a real actual like sort of not a bond, but like connection, I guess, to an extent, where they really connected with the character of Adam because he interacted with them in a way that was really unique compared to every other character in the story. And then yeah, he was a lot more nuanced as well. And that really only comes out near the end because during the entire most of the ARG, you kind of just see him as like an evil skinwalker that's leading the tourism bureau and working for the tour guide. But he gets more nuanced initially when he finds out about the investigator group and Daniel and doesn't report them to the tour guide because he wants to see what'll happen. And so that's like the first little clue that like there's something more going on with him. And then over time you get like eventually his whole backstory where I literally just sat in front of a camera and monologued for like 10 minutes. Uh and basically just exposed his backstory. I wanted to do it in a more interesting way, but I literally couldn't think of one.
You know,
So
monologue's a monologue.
a monologue's a monologue, and I think I delivered it pretty well. So, I did my best. And that was like his ultimate, like the big reveal of him like in front of the wall doing his whole monologue where he reveals his entire backstory and what he really wants is to just be free. And like that's the moment where like he really becomes like a full-fledged character.
Yeah.
And so, and that did develop just a lot over time. Like where I would think like, okay, well, where can I go with the Adam character next? Or like, what's driving him? Why didn't he report them to the the skinwalkers because
Mhm.
obviously like I couldn't have him report them to the skinwalkers in March because like there was still another 8 months of game left or whatever. So I had to come up with a reason, but I couldn't also just leave the investigators like no one knows about them because that's not realistic.
Mhm.
So that was kind of a coincidental thing that I had Adam discover them and then not report them. Then I had to explain it. And so,
Mm.
over time that developed. And then like I brought in the Light Drinker 97 channel, and that was also pretty improvised. And then I had to figure out who Light Drinker was, and I was like, okay, Light Drinker is this one character named Andrea Illman who has like no lore, so now I can make her Light Drinker. And then she's an ally of Adam, so now Adam and her are working together, so they're part of the rebellion. And so it just really just spun out of just a lot of improvisation,
Mhm.
very randomly. But it really kind of worked out in the end far better than I ever would have expected. Like shockingly so. It's like everything actually makes sense and there's very little contradiction, which is surprising. But yeah. So Anyway, Adam just spun out of a lot of random decisions and just conveniences, really, and just trying to explain away the conveniences eventually in interesting ways. Yeah.
And I think you get away with the monologue in part because Adam is an incredibly Shakespearean kind of what's the word? Uh Anti-hero, I guess would be
Hmm.
how I would put it. He you know,
Yeah.
Oh,
he
like
reeks of
revenge plot.
revenger. Yeah,
Yeah,
he reeks of
revenge
revenger.
plot.
And it works really well. I think in a way that because he also speaks in this very particular way that I think
Hmm.
for a different character with a different set of motivations would come off as kind of kitschy, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, well, that was another thing that came out of just improvisation, I guess, because I had already voiced a character in like an audio log
Mm.
early before I made myself Adam. So I was like, well, okay, Adam has to have a different voice now. And I was like, well, how can I make myself sound like as much of an asshole as possible? And I was like, well, if
Damn it,
I
I peaked
just
the audio.
give myself like a really kind of like enunciated voice, and I was like, hello, my name is Adam, and it's like very, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
that's one of the excellent things about Walker Creek and a lot of the better ARGs is that they are born of contingencies. Like you're
Yeah.
making bets about what will happen, but that's not necessarily what plays out because they are interactive. They're meant to be played by a larger group of people.
Yeah.
Um, and so I guess kind of the question that arises out of that is for folks that are interested in making ARGs, and this is a growing number of people that are being inspired by projects like Walker Creek and other things like that. You know, how did you go about embracing contingency? Because that's not something that really a lot of people are eager to do. Like most people want things to set a plan and go through the plan and make it work out as you originally planned it. So how did you go about embracing contingency, and what advice would you give to people out there that are looking to make similar projects?
About like actually taking the time to figure out like a reason like I keep saying the word improvisation, right? But it
Mm.
wasn't actual improvisation. It was like I would take a few weeks to think about it and figure out the idea and then execute it. But it just like I didn't have it all planned out from the beginning. So that's what I mean by improvising. Like I didn't just like turn on the camera and make some stuff up and then be like, "Okay, this is the story now." Like, and I know there are a lot of ARGs that do that, and some of them are successful and some of them aren't. But the way Walker Creek did it was that like, yeah, I made stuff up as I went along, but I made sure to really think about it before I actually like put it out publicly. And there were like certain plot lines and ideas that did get cut, literally just like on a week to week basis where I would be like, one week I'm like, okay, well, this is the answer to that mystery. And then I would be like, well, no, this is kind of stupid. I should change it. I'm gonna change the answer to the mystery. And luckily, I still have a week before that video has to go live, so I can change it. So, it's definitely still embracing those moments, and actually interacting with the audience in a unique way because there were the live calls, and then even in the videos, there were moments where I like name dropped major fans for certain things. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't really like just go as I went along. So I am glad on one hand that I did it, and I think it's a really good way to make an ARG if you're good at planning in advance and sort of working quickly on your feet. Because you need like I needed to come up with plot lines in less than like a week or less than a month and figure out like this is going to change the whole trajectory of the story. How do I, actually make this work? So, if you're quick on your feet, it works. Personally, I wouldn't do it again, and I'm not going to. My next ARG, all planned out in advance, except for like little details on like the social media. I'm not going to plan out in advance. Like, and I'll have like the live calls and stuff in the next ARG too. But like the actual storyline, I do want to plan it out in advance because it was a lot of stress actually like writing the script while running the community, while also filming, while also like planning out the ending of the series, while also balancing my personal life. Like it's so many elements, like having to do every stage of production at once while also managing a live community, like is so stressful. And so, it's not something I would do. especially as a single creator. I think something like Everyman Hybrid, right? They had 3 people, and they did make it up kind of as they went along, but they had 3 of them, so it
Well,
was
and
a
more in the
smaller work.
background, to my
Well, yeah, and they
knowledge.
had
Yeah.
other people. Yeah, they did as well. So, yeah, but I was a completely solo creator. Like, as I said in the documentary, it was literally just me and then the actors, and all the actors did was act. So I was responsible for everything else, like all of the writing, all of the puzzles, all of the literally everything. So, yeah.
And that gets to a fan question actually, pretty seamlessly. Um, it's actually not really a question; it's more of a statement, but I'll turn it into a question. It reads: Walker Creek is considered by many, and totally not being biased here, as a masterpiece. That includes many of the flaws found within it, and flaws is in quotation marks, that one may judge. Uh, in parentheses, I personally don't see them as major, but I've talked with you on that kind of thing, so I won't go too in deep here. But I guess the question is, so what's your critical appraisal of Walker Creek, looking back on it now? And I know you did do some of that within the documentary, but in short form, what's your critical appraisal of Walker Creek, and how's that going to translate into future ARG work?
Well, it's been like over a year since I did the documentary, so I have a bit more perspective now looking back on it. So, I would say Walker Creek, I find it to be really impressive. Just like I look back at it and I'm like, I did all of that by myself. Like I made all of this content, like I wrote all of this, I filmed all like it's kind of mind-boggling because I don't remember like 90% of it. Those memories just kind of blurred away. It was like a year and a half long fever dream. But so like I'm really shocked at the amount of content I made, and I'm really shocked at the quality of the overall story, and then certain moments within the filmmaking as well, like within the videos that I do feel really proud of in the end. And especially the finale episodes, I'm really proud of the fact that I even made like almost a full hour of like fully scripted, like fully film, like shot, basically almost a feature film, basically, in like a month or 2 months, plus all of the vlogs and all the analog horror videos and everything. So I'm pretty proud of just the quality and amount of content I made. But I do look back and I see a lot of moments where things could have been better. Like the improvising. It did work out in the end generally. But that doesn't mean it wasn't messy, and that doesn't mean it couldn't have been infinitely better. Like, one part in the documentary I talk about is the character of Nick Osborne and, Trevor McNeil, who both have these, like, blog-like websites, and they basically they could have been merged if I had thought of it earlier, but I didn't, and so they had to be 2 separate characters, and that was just messy. And also, the players weren't able to get an emotional connection to Nick, whereas they would have had an emotional connection if it had just been Trevor the whole time. So, like, that's one instance where it could have been cleaner. The thing with Adam, obviously, like if it wasn't a AI generated profile picture at first before it changed to me, like that would have been better. There's a lot of instances where, the story writing was just a little messy. And like generally where like the pacing was maybe a little messy because it wasn't planned out in advance. And then during the actual videos, like the finale episodes, I feel so mixed on them because on the one hand, it's really impressive how much like what we did and that we managed to get all of it shot. But on the other hand, there's moments in there where I'm like, that acting was so bad, or like that shot was so bad. We like rushed it so much. Like, especially the lake scene, like Lake Day. I love that day. I love that video. Like the whole confrontation at the lake is fantastic. But at the same time, it's like the most rushed scene in the entire series because we filmed the entire thing in one day at a public park with like a million distractions and issues and problems. And so like there's moments in that where I'm like, this continuity doesn't match. This color is terrible. We should have reshot that. This line is so badly delivered. Like, I needed to ADR half of it. Like, there's this one scene where, like, Anna, or who plays the tour guide, like, grabs Adam and is, like, restraining him. And, like, obviously, I'm not actually restrained. Like, I could have easily broken free. Like, it doesn't look at all realistic. So it's like, there's so many moments like that where I'm like, that could have been better if we didn't rush it. But generally, I am still really happy with what I made. And I think even if it's kind of a lot of it's like B movie quality, like it's still good. It's still something I'm proud of.
Ghost describes it as a horror telenovela, and that is a
That's
very
kind of true.
accurate
That's kind of
description.
yeah.
Yeah. You know, and I'm told
Yeah.
by a little birdie told me, IKI watched the documentary, that geese were a problem the
Oh
entire
yeah.
time, and yeah, damn, that sucks.
Yeah, there's a whole montage in the documentary about the issues we had at Lake Day. Best moment in the film, honestly, but yeah, that was a terrible day.
Well, I think we are going to go on our short break here since it's 8 o'clock at CST. Well, it's later or earlier for you viewers. We will be back in 5. You guys want to do 5 minutes or 10 minutes?
Sounds good. I can take 5.
We'll take 5. We're going to take 5. We'll be right back. I think I'm audible. Welcome. We are ready to get back to it. Let me turn the let me duck the audio down here pretty soon.
Oh man, I just saw Ghost mention Hosts Reborn in the chat. That's a. Oh
They've
man,
been trying to get me to mention
that was a
Hosts
chapter.
Reborn the entire time.
That was a whole chapter.
Was it?
It was a 5 day long. I think 5 days. Yeah. It was like this one puzzle in Walker Creek that like they couldn't solve it. It was kind of stupid. Kind of my bad. But like I kept updating the website like every couple hours for like literally 5 days, giving them more and more hints, and they eventually finally solved it. But it took 5 days and like a dozen hints. So
That's incredible.
yeah.
But they got it done, so that's great. Welcome.
They got it done.
Welcome back, everybody. We're glad we're back. We're gonna talk more about analog horror this hour, before wrapping up, letting Alex drop all of his links, and packing it up, and then we'll see you in a month. We do have some announcements to make on that regard towards the end of the stream, but we're not going away. Well, I don't know, Alex, you can join us whenever, but but we're not Ludic's not disappearing for another year and then coming back again with another Alex Hera interview. Although that would be funny, and I'm gonna put that in my cap.
We could do a Billie Eilish.
A Billie.
A Billie Eilish of every year interview with Alex Hera.
That's so true. That'd be fun.
So we're gonna move towards the analog horror documentary for the back half here. So with that, I'll let I think Kit's question is the one that's leading this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a question. So the SCP Foundation is something that I thought was kind of not having as much of a background in it. Seems to be incredibly similar to how Slenderverse and Creepypasta worked. They came out around the same time, but Slenderverse and Creepypasta are kind of the building blocks of analog horror and a much more widespread influence. And SCP is still very much small and kind of underground. So do you think analog horror has any roots in the SCP Foundation? And then if not, like, why do you think the SCP Foundation has less of an impact than Creepypasta and Slenderverse, despite the amount of similarities?
Well, I think there definitely is some impact that SCP had on analog horror. I know one of the interviewees, I believe it was Turkey Lennon III, but I won't swear on it, said that he had written an SCP before and was somewhat inspired by SCPs. I know that there's a lot of overlap in the fan bases, like a lot of analog horror fans talk about SCP or like SCP. And I know that I've seen a lot of SCP analog horror videos. I saw them a lot in my research. Only after like analog horror had already blown up. It wasn't like the SCP Foundation started analog horror or something.
Yeah.
But a lot of people have adapted SCP stories into analog horror videos. That's a very common thing. So there's definitely a lot of overlap in the fan bases, and it definitely does have some impact. I know there are a couple SCP stories about like analog televisions or technology in certain ways. I've heard of a couple. I don't know how much impact they necessarily have, but I know they exist and they're not like brand new either.
Yes.
The only reason the impact would be smaller is just that it's a little newer in a way. I don't think technically the actual start date is really that much different than Creepypasta and Slenderverse, but when it actually like took off was a little later.
Yeah.
And also again, as you said, it's a lot smaller of a fan base than Creepypasta or Slenderverse were. And I think largely that's because SCP has a little bit more of like a narrow focus. Like the Slenderverse is just anywhere on the planet and you just kind of have to have Slenderman mentioned in some way. And Creepypasta is just any horror story that's written in this like one specific style, which is very vast. And SCP is a little bit more focused than that because it has like the little overarching lore of the Foundation and like stuff like that. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think something that also plays into the amount of impact it has is the fact that it's incredibly like academic and scientific in a lot of the writing, which doesn't, it's not as going to be as fun of a read as something like a creepypasta would when it comes from such an academic scientific place because
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, there's a bit of like a skill level there, right? Like
Yeah.
creepypastas, you could write them like a journal entry, and it could be
Yeah.
like how you would actually write. Whereas with SCP, you actually have to like follow a very specific like kind of style, or you just won't be your story won't be popular at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent. I want to move on to a question that about kind of one of the concepts that really underpins the documentary, and you even had a little montage of all the people that you interviewed saying the word nostalgia, and basically everybody you interviewed were like, oh yeah, nostalgia. That's
Yeah.
that's one of the big things that underpins the whole genre. So I wanted to ask, like, what are some things that trigger nostalgia for you, and then more specifically, like, which analog horror creations trigger the most nostalgia for you personally?
Well, I think things that personally trigger nostalgia for me are like obviously just things from my childhood. So like I grew up with a lot of VHS tapes. I lived in a smaller town that wasn't quite as up to date with technology, so we were still using VCRs up until like the late 2010s. So, or I mean early 2010s. So, a lot the analog stuff does bring a lot of nostalgia for me, and especially like Gemini Home Entertainment and stuff like that, which has like these kind of educational VHS style things. That's definitely one that like Gemini was when I really got obsessed with analog horror. Because I really liked it with Local 58, but I wasn't quite like fully hooked in. I just thought it was really scary. Gemini Home Entertainment is when I was really like, oh wow, this is like something I am obsessed with now.
Mhm.
Yeah,
And
and to kind of like, oh, go ahead, Ren.
no, in analog horror, so this is going to cross all three roads. But it's interesting because we had a conversation. It's no secret that we're making our own little ARG project. We aren't saying more than that, but we were talking about uh, productions of locality. Like how do you make something feel like it's a local environment in an analog horror film or whatever else, and talking about Walker Creek and Gemini in the same breath, and being like, well, both of these foundationally are really concerned with of making you feel like there's a small town here, of a small collective of people who are really invested in the state of affairs, that nobody else seems to be particularly invested in outside of the town. Um, and so there seems to be this kind of thread. I mean, maybe it's just you and the creator of Gemini, but I think there's more there in analog horror that moves towards specifically that local municipality, that I hadn't really noticed before looking at both of those things in concert. You're the analog horror researcher, professional here. So I was wondering if you'd have anything to say about the relationship between like small towns and analog horror.
Don't know how much of a link there really is thematically. Like obviously it does pop up a lot. Like even Local 58 is set in like a very specific county. I think for the most part there's maybe something about like small towns have always been kind of a staple in horror media. Like there's always a small town with, some dark secret. With, analog horror specifically, I think really like a lot of the people doing local things kind of have just copied off of Local 58 to an extent. But I also think, like with analog horror, a lot of it is dealing with some sort of like large scale event. Like Mandela Catalog is about the invasion of the alternates. Gemini Home Entertainment is about the invasion of the Skinwalkers. Walker Creek is about the like a hosted society that's like been living there for hundreds of years. And you can't really tell a wide story like that uh in a not small town, because otherwise you're sort of breaking the reality of it. Like you're not going to say, oh, there's an invasion of alternates in Los Angeles. Like it doesn't work. You have to like set it in this small area so that you have a reason for why nobody else knows about it, why, and it's a way to get people immersed. Like with Walker Creek, one of the biggest pieces of feedback I received was that Walker Creek felt completely real, and that sometimes players forgot it wasn't a real town. And that was really the goal there. And I think so. I think it's really about immersion to an extent. I think that's definitely a large part of it.
And when we do get like talking about the concept of nostalgia, even within the field of nostalgia studies, I guess that it's a contested concept. And so like there's it's conceptualized in two ways generally, um, through a an individualistic kind of melancholic nostalgia that you're simply yearning for the past, or on the other hand a radical nostalgia that critically engages with the past through the feelings that are evoked while interacting with materials that conjure nostalgia. So do you think, or I don't know, I guess what do you think of this kind of dualism and how it plays in with the genre of analog horror?
I think both definitely come into play. It probably would depend on the creator and the project. But the sort of yearning for the past is pretty apparent in series like Local 58 and things like that, where Chris Straub is kind of recreating his childhood experiences with local television to an extent. Um, but yeah, there definitely is a sort of like hands-on aspect to it as well, where you're personally like recreating these things from your childhood and like kind of actively warping these things that you used to know, and are now changing and manipulating and corrupting in a way to create horror. Um, like analog horror, I believe someone, I don't remember who at this moment, described it as sort of like the corruption of nostalgia. So that's something that I think is very prevalent in analog horror.
Yeah, and well, and it makes sense, right? Like to some extent, fusing the concepts we're throwing around here, that corruption happens, it kind of has to happen in the small town if it's an American production, right? I mean, we had tossed around. I remember in the process of talking about the research, at one point, uh, what analog horror existed coming from other countries, and if it would even
Mhm.
look distinct, from how distinct it would look from American analog horror, and I don't know that we ever chased that down. I can't recall, but it does make sense on on a fundamental level if we're talking about gripping with nostalgia. I mean that it would go back to small town America in some way, shape, or form for us.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, we talked about it in terms of, and this is a major kind of development in the field of nostalgia, but nostalgia in the former Soviet Union, for kind of the things that gave meaning to life in Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan and all those places where there was a society, there was meaning that was given to your actions and your symbols and your relationships with people. And when the Soviet Union was dismantled in the early 1990s, all of those symbols and all of those actions that had been built into that society for 75 years were just left by the wayside. They were forgotten. They were no longer part of the official institutions of society. And so there's a major nostalgia within those settings, for those ways of life, which are foreign to us here in the United States, and elsewhere that didn't live under the Soviet system. But for people in the former Soviet Union, there's massive nostalgia for those symbols because it gave life meaning, and it gave life a different meaning than it has now in those places. Which is, that's it's kind of a little interesting anecdote to go saying like, yeah, nostalgia or analog horror or similar genres that draw on nostalgia in different parts of the world are going to be very historically specific,
Mhm.
materially specific. Um, so yeah, I just thought I'd finish Ren's thought of where that conversation went when we had that some weeks ago.
Yeah, I think it's a recurring conversation because we also talked about, and I know you didn't get, oh man, I wish you had gotten Martin Walls,
I
so
know. I tried.
badly. Oh, because oh man, I mean, there's so much to say um, about the Walton Files and how
Mhm.
visually
I know.
distinct it really is.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder. I've wanted to ask Martin at some point. I don't know him obviously, but about how much of that filmmaking comes from, because I understand I believe he's Chilean, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I wonder how much of that comes from like his national cinema, because I don't know another series that looks like that.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, I guess that does make Although now I want to see a Soviet analog horror film. So
Yeah.
thanks,
Well,
Robert.
I will tell you, I know several years ago I saw one that it was a analog horror video in Russian. I couldn't read any of it because it was in Russian, but I know it existed and I watched it and it was kind of creepy even though I couldn't read any of it. So I know it exists. I just don't really know how to find it or properly engage with it, I would say.
It does feel like
Like, because
Stalker.
Kraina
Sorry.
Grajivub TV is from Poland, and that definitely has, like, a very distinct style, but it has subtitles, so I can actually, engage with it and analyze it properly, whereas, trying to really dig into foreign analog horror would take a lot of effort.
Yeah, and I, again, maybe you have something to say to this, but it does sometimes feel like Stalker is deeply caught up in the aesthetics that then be later,
Mhm.
in terms of cinematic history, become analog horror. I don't know how many analog horror creators have really engaged with Stalker as a film, but man, it feels that and Eraserhead also.
Mhm. Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, just and that one I have more faith in the fact that at least some of the older creators probably have seen Eraserhead because I know it
Mhm.
floats around the unfiction creator circles often.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and to the point that's being made in the chat, yeah, there is analog horror being made in other parts of the world, and it wouldn't be something that we would, really essentially be able to immediately identify as analog horror because it doesn't fit our culturally situated definition of it. But it is definitely being made, especially because Alex in the documentary established that one of the foundational aspects is nostalgia. We know nostalgia is a universal feeling. We know that exists across space and time, across cultures. And so if that's the one of the building blocks, then we know that these nostalgic reproductions exist everywhere. It's and so this is this is more definitely more than an American or Western centric genre that's coming to life and being examined. Um, do we want to, Ren? Do you want to ask? Or actually, can you check the chat and see if there's
Oh,
questions
I've been
there?
watching the chat. Just keep rolling, man.
All right. Ren, do you want to ask your analog horror question?
Sure, I can ask my analog horror question. All right. Which I'm trying to find the one that you've tagged here.
It's the one that's not highlighted in yellow. It's
The one
not.
that's not highlighted in yellow. Okay.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Ah, yes, I see it. Okay. So one of the things I've said in private, I think quite a bit, and I think maybe I've said this to you. I know I've said this to you on several occasions. Is that you've captured this like zeitgeist, right? Like it's very clear to me that you've got a grip in that documentary on what the general sense of that community views itself as. You portray it excellently. And I wonder, because I don't think I've actually asked you this at all. How did that congeal for you? Like, how did you gather the right aesthetics that you wanted to use? And at what point when you were making this, did it move? Was it your conception to get at a kind of totalizing view that would like explain how analog horror creators feel about the history of their own genre? Or was it more of your conception to get to something that was perhaps more objective? And I'm just offering a weirdly backhanded critique that I don't mean to be offering.
Well, the actual development of the documentary is pretty interesting. I didn't set out to initially make a documentary at all. I was just going to make a little video essay about the history of analog horror. And at the end, I actually planned to sort of say, like, okay, we had a good run. This is it. Kind of, we're done. And I don't know why I had that idea. I don't really remember why I felt that way. But that was initially how I thought about it. And then I was like, well, I want to do another documentary after I did the Walker Creek one. And so I was like, well, why don't I try to like interview these people? And I was also on a personal level, I was like, well, I literally made a whole analog horror series. My entire career as a filmmaker so far has been inspired by like multiple people in the analog horror space, so I might as well see if I can just talk to them, give me an excuse to chat with them. And so I
Yeah.
was like, okay, I'm gonna do that. So I did, and started doing like a lot more research, like really in-depth stuff. And that's when I sort of got at, a lot of the concepts that were core to analog horror, and I really started thinking about it a lot more critically. about why people like why it's so popular and why so many creators engage with it, and respond to it. And the thing that really jumped out at me a lot was the low barrier of entry concept that I talked pretty significantly about in the documentary. And then I'm pretty sure almost every interviewee also brought up, or at least agreed with if I brought it up, that was like a really big part of analog horror's popularity, and was a really important part of the community's identity as well. Because, just like in the Slenderverse and just like in Creepypasta, and also probably SCP as well, there's really, really significant overlap between fans and creators. Like most fans have created at least a analog horror video. Like it's very common, or at least they aspire to eventually create an analog horror video. So, and that's something you don't necessarily see everywhere, especially outside of the unfiction field. But even within the unfiction field, in more general like ARG communities, you don't see that necessarily quite as often as you do specifically in like analog horror. So that was something that really jumped out at me. And then additionally, like just the general development of the history, especially like bringing Nexpo into it and how people watched Nexpo's video and then they went on to, join the general analog horror community. So that was another aspect of capturing sort of what makes the community tick. And these things really just came out in the research and then came out in the interviews, where I would interview someone and they would say like, "Oh yeah, I found out about it from Nexpo's video," and then I interviewed someone else and they said, "Oh yeah, I found out about it from Nexpo's video," and I was like, "Wait a second, this seems to be a common theme. I should
Mhm.
interview Nexpo," and so I did. So but yeah, a lot of it really like it just came out as I researched and sort of really kind of identified what made the genre tick and what drove it to such great success and popularity compared to most of the rest of the unfiction field. And so it wasn't a goal from the start, but towards the end or towards the middle, really, it was something that I really started identifying as a goal in identifying what exactly it was that made this work.
So did
Yeah.
you get from, so there's not like a congealing moment, right? But I imagine that that process really comes out when you're sitting down and editing and you're like, shit, I've got, all this damn footage I have to put together. Um, I have to organize it somehow. And so, I wonder then, okay, sure. Uh, how does that, how did that turn into an editing process for you?
Well, the editing process, by that point, already had a lot of things pretty set in stone. I did it on purpose because with the analog horror documentary, it was a kind of a messy project where I was doing a lot of writing and doing the interviewing and doing the researching kind of all at the same time, which wasn't necessarily the ideal way to do it because then I would have to go back and revise a lot of the writing or just fully like cut out chunks and rewrite them from scratch, depending on new information and stuff. So I made sure to leave the editing as like something I really like didn't kind of overlap with the other stages. So I had the full script with like all of the interview bits except for Chris Straub's. And that's when I really started going like really deep into the editing. So by that point, what I did was I transcribed all of the interviews into text, and then I made a big Google Doc where I just like made like 20 or 30 category headings and I just put in all the different quotes under each different category and just figured out what kind of overlaps and resonances there were between the interviewees. And I noticed some that I didn't notice before, and there were some that I already knew were there. And so I really focused on just like getting everything kind of in the same place. And that's where the montages mostly come from, is like from that, big collection of like it would be a tab that says like digital horror. And then it would just be all the quotes from every interviewee about digital horror. And then I would sort of like see if I could cut those together or like, any other topic. And so, that's how I ended up getting to that point. And then during the editing, things didn't change all that drastically. It was kind of already pretty set in stone with the script and everything. But then Chris Straub came in super late. He didn't respond to me for months, and then he was like just on some random weekday he responded to an email from like 3 weeks earlier and was like, "Yeah, I'll do it." And I was like, "I'm already like almost done, man."
Oh my god.
And so basically I had to go back and do another whole stage of rewrites and altering, and a bunch of re-editing to put Chris into some earlier montages that he wasn't in before. And then I had to
Mhm.
redo all the music and all the visuals for that segment to make it it was a whole thing. But uh I'm really glad that he did say yes because it made the documentary much, much better. Uh but yeah, anyway, so a lot of it was just researching, just talking to people. That was where the real congealing moments always came. Was when I would talk to someone and they would either say something really interesting I hadn't thought of before, or they would say the same thing someone else had already said, and I would be like, okay, that's something I need to focus on now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Sorry, Alex.
this is a question from the chat that I think really pertains to kind of what we're talking about right now, specifically when it comes to like the interview process and how. Well, Trombone asks, why do you think the interviewees were so willing to do interviews? Because you got a lot of very impressive, like Chris Straub has not been interviewed on his work with Logo 58 before. So, like, what do you think was the thing that made a lot of these creators want to do interviews like this with you, be a part of the project?
Well, I'm not 100% sure. I have some ideas about why. I think, definitely people that are so passionate about a space obviously want to talk about it.
Hmm.
So, that's kind of a reason right there that they would want to do it because analog horror is not something it's talked about, but like the creators don't talk about it necessarily. Or at least they're not asked about it by like an outside third party like I was. It would just be like within their own fan base or whatever. And I was really digging into sort of the history and the like actual like in-depth sort of what makes it tick kind of stuff, which again is something that those creators wouldn't normally be able to talk about online or it just wouldn't because they didn't want to. So I think it was an exciting thing for them and it was something brand new that nobody had really done before. So they were willing to talk about it. And also, like in my emails, I was always like very obviously passionate about it.
Yeah.
I'm a little surprised that some of them agreed, considering like I didn't really have that much prior work. Like I had the one documentary, but I hadn't done anything nearly on this scale. But they agreed for the like most people agreed to be interviewed. Well, at least of the ones that responded to me. A lot of people just never responded to me, but I don't know if that was because they were ignoring me or just because they didn't see the email. That's a very common thing. Like Chris didn't see the email, so it just took him a while to get to it. So I don't know. But anyway, yeah. So people like talking about things they're passionate about, and I gave them an outlet to do that. That would actually end up being a impressive final project if all went well. So I would expect that's kind of the reason. And also another reason that I think might be true, though I can't completely verify it, is that nobody had really asked. Like nobody else is doing the same coverage. Nobody is really interviewing analog horror creators. No one's even trying, or at least they weren't when I was doing it.
Mhm.
Since my documentary, I've seen interviews, more interviews. But when I did it, like early 2022, there was very little actual like interviews with analog horror creators. So I'm thinking most of them just probably had never been asked or had only been asked like once or twice. So it was still something like relatively rare. And like, Nexpo, I've never seen an interview with Nexpo anywhere on the internet. And I won't say one doesn't exist, but I've never seen it and I looked for one and I never found one. So, that leads me to think maybe I was the first person to ever even try to ask him. So, maybe. I'm not sure, but that's a possible reason as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I've
No,
never seen
I
Alex Hera and Nexpo in the same room, so
so
who's to say? Sorry, go ahead, kid. I had to get that one in.
no, that's okay. I didn't really have anything else to say. There was another actually question in the chat specifically related to interviewing people from Ghost. If you could interview any one person from horror and one person from outside of horror or a group, who would they be?
Well, just for the sake of interviewing them, not for like a project or anything,
Hmm.
I mean, I'd probably just choose one of my favorite directors. Like I'd
Yeah.
probably choose for within horror, I would say like maybe Mike Flanagan because I really like a lot of his work and I think he's really interesting and has a lot of interest. Every time I see an interview with him, he has such interesting things to say about the horror genre. Um Though actually, I might have to. I'll change my answer. It'd be Guillermo del Toro. That'd be the one. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, revised answer.
Everybody liked that.
Yes.
It is a great answer.
It is a wonderful answer.
And aside from the interviews, that I mean, there was another portion of the documentary where you really delved into the prehistory
Mhm.
of the analog horror genre. That was the whole first half of the documentary, and you covered so much ground with the prehistory. Like many other deep dive videos that I've seen, not only covering analog horror, but other various genres. They kind of they'll do a little bit of prehistory, and then they'll kind of like push the rest to the side because that's difficult work. But I wanted to ask, like, what was one of the most surprising prehistorical discoveries that you made when doing the research? Like, what part were you like, wow, I can't believe that's related, but it actually is?
I don't have a moment where I could say something that I can't believe is related, in the prehistory. But with Videodrome, that was a really interesting, situation
Yeah.
because it was something, I had identified it pretty early on as something kind of relevant, but I kind of brushed over it in the first draft of the script. And I kind of went, "Well, there's this movie called Videodrome. It uses, like, analog televisions, and it has some interesting thematic resonances," and I just kinda moved on. And then you can thank Wren for pushing me to go back to Videodrome because Wren was like, "I think there's something more here," and so I was like, "Okay, I'll take a look," and there definitely was more there, to the point where I identify Videodrome as, like, the origin of the same themes and, like, ideas of analog horror, basically, like, the origin of a lot of that stuff. And so, it plays a very important role in the history that I almost completely ignored at first, and only went back to later, and I'm very glad I did. The whole prehistory section was expanded significantly partway through development. It was originally a lot shorter, but then I found more topics to talk about, and I expanded on the ones that I already had. And there's still more room for prehistory. I was very specific about which projects I chose. I chose like the really, really big ones. I could have done probably a whole hour about prehistory, if I wanted to. Like there was more there that I could have sifted through, but I didn't. I just kept it to half an hour because I knew viewers would want to talk, like see me talk about analog horror itself. So I was like, I'll lay the foundation, like the important foundational bits that they need to know, and then I'll get to the fun part.
I
Yeah.
remember so what happened is I had Videodrome in the script and I was like, hold on, wait a moment. I went onto the YouTube and did literally like 5 minutes of work and I found the audio commentary from the Criterion of Videodrome.
Yeah.
And I linked it in the notes, I think, on one of the drafts of the
Mhm.
script. And I was like, maybe you should listen to this. Who's to
Yeah.
say?
I listened to the entire thing like 3 times, and I, like, included a clip from it in the documentary. Yeah.
And then Chris Straub goes and says the same
And then
thing.
Chris Robb said the exact same thing as David Cronenberg, which was just fantastic. And the funny thing is Chris Robb had never even seen Videodrome, so
Oh, it's remarkable.
There's the shocking thing right
yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Oh God, I wonder if he went and watched Videodrome after the documentary.
I really hope so. I know he'd love it.
I do. My opinion of Videodrome has long been, it is a film that does Marshall McLuhan better than Marshall McLuhan.
Oh, yeah, no, totally. It
But
distills the good parts of that.
yeah, I'm so glad that it exists, and also I'm so glad that Marshall McLuhan does not show up in the documentary at all.
No, he does show up in the analog horror, conspiracy
I
board.
know
He's
he
there in the corner.
appears, but thank God
He
he doesn't make an appearance. You know what I
Yes,
mean?
yeah, that's fair. He gets a little reference, a little Easter egg.
um, I know the other thing is by the end of the documentary, you were talking to me about things you had run into that were so late in the process, and you were like, "Shit, this is more prehistory." glitch art is the thing that I immediately remember because I think
That was the big one.
we both ran into it at about the same time for totally independent reasons, and we're like,
Yeah.
wait a second.
Yeah, I know. I'm so annoyed that I discovered it so late. It would have gone perfectly with the vaporwave section, but we didn't have to, it was too late. I
Yeah.
didn't want to go back and revise the whole thing. So
And probably
yeah,
good on you.
yeah, I mean, I thought about throwing in like one line and just say like, and also glitch art had been a thing for a while. That was important. But I felt like that was kind of doing it a disservice. Like, yeah, I could try to throw in one line, but it'd be better to just leave it out at that point. Let someone else come along and talk about it.
Yeah, and that segues really well because like vaporwave was one of those things that for me that was kind of my introduction to the broader genre of analog, like nostalgia fuel type of stuff, and like some of the main thematics of vaporwave, um, as an artistic form, as a musical form, the aesthetic genre is anti-consumerism and anti-capitalism as part of its what kind of holds it together and gives it meaning. So is do you see any resonance of like that anti-consumerism and anti-capitalism within the analog horror genre? And if so, where do you see it? And could you explain that a little bit?
Don't know if it's actually something that I see in the overall genre. I did spend some time pretty late in the documentary process really thinking about it and thinking about if there were more resonances beyond just the aesthetic. Um, and I couldn't really find any like big threads throughout analog horror as a whole. I won't say they weren't there, but I'm just saying I didn't think of them. The only thing I found were there were specific videos, I would say, that like landed on the same themes. Like there's one video in Analog Archives that had a vaporwave aesthetic and was like themed around a mall advertisement and had a lot of those like same kind of ideas. But I wouldn't say that it's as far as I think and found in my research, it wasn't like a long-standing thread throughout the genre.
Somewhat ironically, it does get picked up in Stranger Things, though.
That is very true. Yeah.
Like maybe the
Incredibly
one,
ironically.
yeah, maybe the one project that like you're like, why is this the one that's doing the vaporwave mall is evil? I guess they're evil
Yeah.
Russians in the end, not an evil corporation, but
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, it's
and
always the Russians.
It
well,
always
because
is.
I mean, they had to justify the amount of toys they have.
Mhm.
Is the thing. So make it evil Russians rather than evil consumerism. So
Yeah.
we can still buy the 11 figurine.
Exactly.
That's where that whole series lost me, was when they just decided to fall back on the
Evil
tired Cold
Russians.
War trope of, oh, all this evil stuff is happening. What's going on? We're trying to explain it. Oh, I guess it was the Russians. It's just
Yeah,
such a tired
incredibly
trope.
tired.
I beat that horse to absolute pulp. Um,
Taking all of the 80s tropes and then not looking at them in a critical way at all. Very
Yeah.
Stranger Things.
Very Stranger Things. Kit has a couple of really excellent questions that I feel will round this interview out really well.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna pass those up to Kit.
Okay. I'll go with the second one. So it's been almost half a year since the analog horror documentary came out. Have you seen any changes in the community or any changes in the genre that you, at the end of it, you were thinking, oh, I really, really want to add this into the documentary, or now if you could go back and make it, you would add that in? Um, is there anything basically large enough that's been worthy of documentation that you think has happened in the past year or was happening closer to the end of production?
I'm not quite sure. With regards to the documentary itself, that was actually a really interesting situation with the Backrooms, where it was emerging and rising to its insane success as I was making the documentary. Like, I
Mm.
started production on the documentary like a week before the Backrooms video went live. And then as I was making the documentary, it became the most popular analog horror series ever like as I was writing the script. And so I was like, well, okay, this changes the ending a bit. And so that was really, and the same with Millennium Horror, which a lot of people call digital horror, but I don't like the name. Millennium Horror also started emerging a lot while I was like writing the documentary script, with like Morley Grove from Remy Abode and a bunch of like one-off videos. And I started really identifying it as like a new sort of trend. So that's really interesting. I do think in terms of analog horror itself, I don't know if I would necessarily say that there have been a lot of major developments. It has sort of seemed like a lot of just the big series have kept on going. Um, but if I had a chance to go back and do it again, I would focus a bit more on the back rooms, or at least I would like add on, because the back rooms have just spiraled so far out of what it was when I was writing the script to like an insane extent. And that's something I would be really interested in actually talking about at length in the analog horror doc, because it's sort of like this whole separate community almost, but it's still analog horror. So it's really developed in a very interesting way that it wasn't developed to when I actually made the film. And then Millennium Horror has kept just developing on and on. I've seen in the past couple months multiple like ARG, like spooky internet YouTubers talk about digital horror, Millennium Horror, and sort of go through like its history briefly, or just talk about what it is, or talk about series that are Millennium Horror. And that wasn't a thing at all when I wrote it. Like it was barely even an idea yet when I
Mhm,
did the documentary, and now it's like a thing that people on YouTube are just making video essays about. It's just a
mhm,
thing that exists now, and it's everyone just kind of goes with it. So those are the two things. Really, just the two things at the end of the documentary was the second to last section was the back rooms, and the last section was Millennium Horror. So those are the two things that have continued to develop really interestingly. That I wish I had, you know, been able to include more of at the time, but it just wasn't developed enough yet.
So you bet on the right horses.
I did, yeah. I ended it on two notes that actually did continue going. So
And Kit, you had another good
Yeah.
one. I
No,
think that would fit.
yeah. Okay, good. I wasn't sure if it fits. So, um,
Oh yeah.
but yeah, you were talking about how the Backrooms has kind of become its own thing with its like boom in popularity. And the thing that I kept on noticing throughout the documentary is how incredibly popular analog horror and the new coming millennium horror uh, is becoming so incredibly popular. And do you think that like boom in popularity will lead to more diversity among analog horror and millennium horror creators that we haven't really we didn't really get to see with the Slenderverse and early analog horror?
like diversity in the actual creators themselves.
Yeah, like diversity in the actual creators themselves, diversity within like the actual like if there are people on screen or voice acting like those characters, and dealing with like uh, you know, problems that different minorities face within the series themselves. Like, do you think that is something that is on its way, or is it going to kind of be with similar to Slenderverse, where we see a lot of the same kinds of people making content?
Well, I'm not quite sure. I mean, the thing is, when there's so many projects in the field, there are a lot of creators and a lot of actors on screen that are, in some way, diverse, or in some way a minority. It's just that those often aren't the projects that take off in popularity. So
Mhm,
if you want to find them, you really have to dig. But they're there. I know they are. I've seen several, and I've seen many creators that are very diverse. It's just they're not like the big names.
mhm.
And I don't necessarily have a, specific answer for why that is. But hopefully in the future, yeah, I would love to see those big series have more diverse creators, and I hope it does happen.
Well, I remember, I mean, I think you can attribute a lot of the success of Smile Guide to coverage of Smile Guide, and that's great. I'm glad it was a hit with our main critics. But as an international production, it was kind of rare that an international non-British ARG. It was kind of rare that
Mm,
it got the perception that it did. But
Yeah.
the thing that comes to mind in a different way with analog horror is to go back to Martin Wall's a Chilean artist making art that doesn't, I mean, sure, it's Five Nights at Freddy's, but it does not look like the kind of stuff that you would expect from an American creator in terms of its visual aesthetics, its roughness, its imperfectness.
Yeah.
And I don't think Martin Walls got popular off of critical success. I think he got popular off of the community lifting that project up. And
Yeah.
that was remarkable just because we don't get a lot of international cinema in ARGs in general, but much less international cinema that becomes the level of popular that the Walton Files really has.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe, I don't know, maybe, we were talking about diversity in terms of intersectionality, but in terms of internationality, I mean, maybe this is a space where we suddenly start seeing more international creators get success on the American regional version of YouTube, which I know that's also a major part of this, is that YouTube is super region locked.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, analog horror is actually pretty interesting in that, like, 3 of the major projects in its history have been from international, creators. Like, there's, Kraina Gujevub TV by, Victor Strubog. There's, CHSS by Turkey Lennon III, and then there's,
CHSS, yeah.
yeah, and then there's The Walton Files by Martin Walls. So, those are 3 very big, well, relatively big series, or at least relatively impactful series. In the case of CHSS, even though it wasn't like incredibly popular, it was very impactful.
Yeah.
And that's something like when you look at the Slenderverse, you don't see any international ARGs that had a big impact on it. It's all American. When you look at, the big ARGs we've kind of had in between the Slenderverse and analog horror, when there was that like kind of 5-year dead period, all of the big ARGs during that phase were American ARGs as well. And then you have analog horror over there. That's like 3 of the major series are international. It's very interesting.
Well, and
And I would expect probably we'll see more of it.
in the case of Slenderman, it's also kind of confusing for me because there are, I mean, you can tell from Slenderverse creators that Junji Ito was on the minds of some of those folks as they thought about how to depict the unreal. I don't know that there. I haven't read any interviews with Victor Surge. If Victor Surge goes on about the visual inspirations for the Slenderman, but it's very Ito light. I wouldn't call Junji Ito, or I wouldn't liken Junji Ito's art to the Slenderman, but there are elements of the Slenderman that feel like they are riffing on Junji Ito's art in a light way.
Yeah.
I do wonder, if they're like what a J horror Slender series would look like. I think it'd be pretty damn compelling.
Yeah, I would be
Be
fascinated.
so cool.
And also I wonder how long YouTube is going to keep this extremely region locked version the way it is, because I really do like. I wonder if there are Indonesian monster ARGs out there that are just like viscerally different than what we're used to, and the region lock just keeps them from kind of success. Yeah. So it's fascinating. You mind if I toss one more at you as we're wrapping up here?
Yeah.
Do you think, in your professional opinion, that some major studio is going to come along and make an always watching in this field?
Yeah, it's gonna happen. Absolutely. There's no way it doesn't happen at some point in the next 10 years. Like even with Slenderman, it took them 10 years, but they did it. They made a Slenderman movie way after it was relevant or would have worked, but they did it. And I guarantee we'll see the same thing here. Especially considering the Backrooms is taking off so much. I would say the 2 that I would hedge my bets on becoming a movie is either the Mandela Catalog or the Backrooms. The Mandela Catalog is a little iffy because it's a little smaller and made by a single creator. So that one, they'd have to deal specifically with Alex and, go through that whole process. The Backrooms, I am 100% sure we're going to get a Backrooms movie at some point because it's a gigantic community, far bigger than even the Mandela Catalog community because it's so vast and there's so many different projects. It's not owned by anyone as far as I know. The possibilities are endless. They could make their own story and do whatever they want. And it's the most popular thing to ever come out of Unfiction. So I guarantee we'll be getting a Backrooms movie within the next decade or so.
Is it possible that a major studio can understand the Backrooms well enough to make a movie that pleases anybody? Or I mean, I guess the other
I didn't
side of the
say we
question.
would get a good Backrooms movie in the
I
next
know,
10 years.
but
Right, exactly. We
Yeah.
won't get a Backrooms movie.
let's try
No,
to
we
be
will
less
Let's be
than
realistic
cynical
here.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's gonna suck, but I mean, if you could pick a
Well,
director,
if they pick the right director, I think they could do it. I just think with like the Slender Man movie, obviously we all like our expectations have been set by what that was
yeah,
and by what
absolutely.
Always Watching was.
Uh-huh.
Those are the only two examples we have of ARGs being turned into films. And they were both terrible because they were both rushed and made by people who didn't understand. So, those are the only two examples we have to draw from. So of course what we expect is something terrible from the Backrooms.
We do have a third. It's called the Cicada movie.
That is
It's
okay.
also
That's
terrible.
the
Jesus
Cicada
Christ.
movie. Yeah, we watched that.
We did
That was
watch that.
terrible.
We
We did
watched
watch
that
that.
with a legendary cast of commentators.
Yeah, that was great.
It was
So
amazing.
that was a terrible movie. I would say that's even a different situation, more so though, because the Cicada doesn't even really have a story.
Yeah,
It's
no
just
kidding.
it's almost entirely puzzles. So, in that movie, the Cicada name is basically only there for the name. So that's why I didn't count it in the list. But yeah,
Fair.
that's fair. You could include it if you want to. It's a gray area.
I can't remember if Channing Tatum is in that movie or if I just felt like I was watching Magic Mike while I was watching the Cicada movie. But it's got like, I don't know if you feel it too, but it feels like Magic Mike.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ. That's quite a thing to say. I think what's kind of
Oh my God.
culminating here is the fact that the Backrooms is such an expansive. I mean, I'm writing my entire dissertation on the Backrooms, and what's going to be required here is another stream to specifically discuss the Backrooms, and potentially with Alex Hera. That would be a fucking cool stream. So. Yeah, I think we're getting about to the end here,
You're
Ren.
right at the end. It's been wonderful to have you,
Yeah.
Alex. It's been wonderful, my
Here.
co-hosts. This is gonna be a good second season of Ludic. That's what I'm gonna say about that. We're going off with a bang. I normally what we do at this point, new viewers, Alex, is we ask, do you have anything you want to promote? And I have some stuff I'll kind of run through, but do you have anywhere we can toss your socials or anything new you're working on you want to say anything about?
Well, I am working on a project right now, but it is not at a stage that's ready to be announced yet. But it's coming in a couple months. Hopefully, it's gonna be here. It's gonna be very, very, very cool. I want to talk about it so bad. Just like with the analog horror documentary, I wanted to scream from the rooftops when I got that Chris Straub interview or when I was doing all that stuff, but I didn't, and I'm not going to this time either. But
That's
I'm
an
working on
incredible amount
something.
of self-restraint.
Yeah, I could never.
I enjoy the feeling of just dropping something incredible and unexpected on an audience. Like the moment I put out the analog horror documentary trailer, and it's that moment where like all of the names come on screen of the people who are featured, and in the Walker Creek Discord, the chat just exploded. Like so that was like that's the feeling I live for, and so I'm gonna do the same thing next time. But if you want to check out my other stuff, I have a YouTube channel that has a bunch of content on it at this point. If you want to follow me on Letterboxd, I update that way too frequently. I review every movie I watch. It's not a good habit, but it's a fun one for me. So and also Twitter. I do tweet sometimes. So those are my three.
Robert, if you want to grab those and just put them in the chat, that'd be great. Again, I would do it myself, but I will destroy the stream if I try. We are this close to a technical issue, and Ash is not getting that bingo. I was also gonna say, there's an adage that the Marble Hornets guys say in the commentary track where Alex goes something to the effect of never tell anyone when you're gonna do anything. That way you can never disappoint them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Oh man. So I'm gonna switch over screens and we'll come right back. But I did want to point to as well. If you haven't seen the history of analog horror or the making of an ARG Walker Creek, what are you doing? Go to Alex's YouTube channel and watch those tonight, tomorrow. Get your friends, watch them with your friends. They're wonderful productions. There's very little content on YouTube that is higher quality in terms of documentary films. So, check it out, enjoy it. These are what the thumbnails look like. They're really good thumbnails. I don't know what else to say. I'll pop back over to this. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on and spending all this time with us. Thank you, audience, for sticking it out. We started with 17 and now we're at 12 viewers. Hell yeah, that's I was expecting nobody to show up for this, and I'm always surprised when people come by. So some Ludic updates. Me, Robert, and Kit are equal co-hosts of the show now. I am no longer the showrunner on my own. And so next month we're doing a one-shot where I talk about all of the weird shit that happened in This Is My Milwaukee, and work you through some of my research process on how I actually build histories of ARGs. After that, we're gonna get a one-shot from Robert, and we're gonna get a one-shot from Kit once a month for the next 3 months. And once a month for the next 3 months, towards the end of the month, we're doing an interview just like this one, to keep things rolling. I know it's not our main bread and butter coverage. For those of you who aren't familiar, our bread and butter coverage is essentially we go through every bit of an ARG and try to reconstruct how it was played. And one of us leads the other two through the ARG. Two of us don't know what's going on. The other one is an expert. It's modeled after Marn's approach on the Argonauts podcast. I would highly recommend you listen to Marn's work. It's just fantastic. But yeah, no, the big reveal that we have is I very recently, and we're still negotiating this, but at the end of the next month, we will be interviewing Eve Ghost, the creator of Under the Surface on this channel. And I'm very excited to have them on, and enjoy their presence just as we have with Alex's. Yeah, so it's going to be great. Robert is going to be getting an interview for March, hopefully, and Kit's going to be trying to get an interview for April. So we'll have 2 more of these hopefully high quality interviews with multiple creators. And then we'll transition into our summer schedule. It's going to be a wild ride. And then by then, you don't need us to tide you over. You'll have potentially, maybe, I'm not making promises for Alex, that would be mean, potentially maybe a documentary. Who's to say?
What?
So there you go. All right. Have a great night, everybody. Thank you for coming. And we'll see you on the next one.